immediately move on to our next session, which is the panel discussion. In fact, it is the most awaited session in every ACMA annual session. So can we move on to the next session? Put the windows. There we are. Hey, Parikshit, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, back to back, another very powerful session. Let me welcome all the dignitaries who are logged in, and I must mention here that the minister has a family exigency. He's not joining us, but I and Deepak met him yesterday, and Deepak is going to talk to us about his meeting with him. And so Deepak, requesting you to welcome all the dignitaries and carry the session forward now on.
Thank you, Vinny. It's unfortunate that the Honorable Minister, Shri Gadkari ji, could not be personally present, but I'm sure his blessings is always there for the sector. At this juncture, I must reiterate that ACMA has always stood for a long-term technology-agnostic roadmap for the automotive industry. The Indian market is large enough to allow for coexistence of multiple technologies. However, our only request to the Honorable Minister is that the introduction of the newer technologies should be well planned to allow for adequate localization of technologies, facilitating the component industry to offer higher value-added solutions and realizing the return on investment. This will indeed be in the interest of not only the domestic industry, but at the nation at large. So, friends, I am now delighted to welcome all our panelists today, some of the most outstanding professionals and brilliant minds in the industry who have made exemplary contribution in shaping our automotive industry. Today, they're leading the way forward and giving us direction in not only navigating the current volatility, but also turning this adversity into an opportunity. We will get more insights as Parikshit Luthra from CNBC will engage with them in an incisive conversation. I heartily welcome Mr. Vipin Sondhi, Vice President SIAM, and MD and CEO Ashok Leyland. Thank you very much, sir, for joining in today. Mr. Hemant Sikka, President, Farm and Equipment Sector, Mahindra & Mahindra. Sir, I think in your leadership, I think the farm sector, not for Mahindra, but for the nation, is doing tremendously well, and all powers to you. Mr. Sunil Kakkar, Chairperson of SIAM Atmanirbhar Sourcing Group and Senior Executive Director, Maruti Suzuki India Limited. Thank you very much, sir, for joining in, and thank you for setting the roadmap of SIAM and ACMA towards the localization path. My friends from the auto community, Mr. Prashant Doraswamy, Country Head, Continental India and MD, Continental Automotive. I think he's the person who is under fire, and I'm sure will give you some insights on the semiconductor issue. And our very own and dear friend, Mr. Ashok Taneja, past President ACMA, and MD and Chief Mentor, Shriram Pistons and Ring. Once again, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today, and I hand it over now to Parikshit to do a very fine panel discussion. Over to you, Parikshit.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jain, for that introduction, and lots to think about. This convention today, the annual convention of Automotive Component Manufacturers Association, has thrown a lot of light on the disruptions that we're looking at in the industry over the last 3 days. And this has really been, I was speaking to Mr. Mehta a few days ago, and I was saying that this is really the automotive week. Now, we're seeing disruptions in vehicle retail. We have the semiconductor shortage that we're dealing with. We have climate change, electric vehicles, and strong messages from the government yesterday that ethanol is definitely going to happen. Flexi fuel vehicles will definitely happen. The industry will have no choice there as well. And the industry was also very clear. There were some strong exchanges over the last 3 days between manufacturers and government on the need for lower costs, reducing the regulatory pressure, taxes as well, so that vehicles are more affordable, because that will be the key for green mobility to really take off. But I'm going to focus today on our theme, living with volatility, survival, revival, and growth. We've got some great industry veterans with us today. We have Mr. Vipin Sondhi, Vice President SIAM and Managing Director and CEO Ashok Leyland, Hemant Sikka, President Farm Equipment Sector, Mahindra and Mahindra, Sunil Kakkar, SIAM, Atmanirbhar Sourcing Group Chairperson and Senior Executive Director of Maruti Suzuki, Mr. Prashant Doriswamy, Country Head, Continental India, and Managing Director, Continental Automotive, and Ashok Taneja, MD and Chief Mentor at Shriram Pistons and Rings. So, gentlemen, let's begin. Let's not waste any more time. And before we begin, I'd just like to quote from the PwC report that ACMA and PwC have come up together. And it says that over the last decade, market volatility has been more frequent and is likely to intensify in future due to various factors. Mr. Tony, let me begin with you now. I was hearing Mr. Amitabh Kant, and he said that climate change and COVID-19, that are these two major disruptions that the auto industry will have to grapple with. Let me ask you, what are the permanent changes that you foresee in the automotive industry because of the pandemic? Let's begin with that. Mr. Sondhi.
Thank you, Parikshit, and lovely to be here. And hello to all the co-panelists. And congratulations to ACMA. Well, several permanent changes, and some may be semi-permanent. Number one, Parikshit, for the first time, at least in my career, health is the reason for an economic slowdown and a lockdown. It's always been a financial crisis. It's been an export-related issue, but not been because of health. So there is going to be a permanent change in the way we look at running businesses and plan ourselves going forward. The second is the need for scenario planning, which I think was covered by PwC as well. Nobody can predict precisely what is going to happen, so it's best to live within certain scenarios that will emerge from time to time. Number three, I think what's happening is perhaps not because of COVID-19, but an acceleration, and you mentioned Amitabh Kant and climate change. Technologies are evolving so rapidly, and as you can see, what was mentioned by the Petroleum Secretary and by Mr. Nitin Gadkari, that we'll have several alternative fuels running simultaneously, some of them relevant to because of the Indian context of foreign exchange and environment. And if I might take two more, customer expectations have changed from specification and performance, kilometers per liter, horsepower, to productivity and profitability. What is my total cost of ownership? What is the turnaround time? And mobility as a service, which is, I think we are ahead in India. The STUs are asking for mobility as a service. Pay per use, pay as you drive, pay how you drive. I mean, at the end of the day, this is reaching astronomical proportions. And finally, digital adoption. Underpinning all of this is the fact that customer experience has to be at the heart. And we've got to use digital technology, no rocket science there, but COVID has accelerated it. And all of this enveloped within sustainable development goals. Like we'll call it climate change, call it anything else, but we have to return to the environment and to society more than we take from it. Back to you.
Right. Great points there, Mr. Sondhi, to begin the discussion. But let me also begin, Mr. Prashant Doriswamy. Now, we'll come to the semiconductor crisis. It's a very, very specific issue. We'll come to that a little later. But, Mr. Doriswamy, looking at all the disruptions in technology that we're looking at, disruptions related to climate change, the pandemic, we have no visibility as to when the world, India, will get a handle on the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe by the end of the year, we'll be able to end of next year, we will be able to vaccinate a substantial portion of our population. But keeping these uncertainties in mind, uncertainties with health, uncertainties in technology, uncertainties with economy, how are you taking your business forward? How do you make sure that you remain on the path of growth despite all these disruptions?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Akma, for this opportunity. Certainly, I think in a strange way, if you see all four worlds which we experienced before have collapsed, and the boundaries have collapsed, and now we have to deal with this, and also how do we make sense of this. Number two, situation also forced leaders to think lot harder about what's a P&L issue and what a balance sheet issue. How do you solve for the short term and a longer term? Of course, the choices, whatever we make, are contextual. Third one is certainly the leadership in the remote context. Communication with employees. How do we inspire people in the remote context? I think bar on leadership has got higher. I think we need to be extremely mindful of how we have been and how are we going to do. I think the tide has certainly turned down on new energy vehicles globally. For example, if I talk about passenger vehicle, this is more towards battery electric vehicles, but I think there are alternate fuels also being tried out. Globally, there certainly will be reductions in the manufacturing of internal combustion engines. So pricing will continue to pose challenges. So with all these challenges, as a technology company, we are at the forefront of innovation and we are striving to create a solution for a sustainable mobility. Maybe we were successful all along by designing and selling ECUs, but I think the future of cars are totally changing. We are moving away from standalone electronic control units to a server-based architecture. Maybe tomorrow we'll be forced to sell a software in cloud. So these are some of the challenges which we anticipated well in advance. And as a part of our transformation journey, we have factored in and we are moving towards this.
Right. Good to hear that, Mr. Doraiswamy. Mr. Taneja, if I can get you in, I think the PwC report had said that every company will have to work on all these three, incorporate all these three words in their business plan: survival, revival, and growth. It has to happen all together. As a leading component manufacturer in the market, how are you embracing the changes that are happening in technology, happening in the economy?
First of all, my greetings to my friends Vipin Sondhi, Hemant Sikka, Sunil Khatkar, and Dr. Prashant Doraiswamy. Glad to be on this panel with you. The fact is that the India growth story continues. We have to remain optimistic about the fact that there is latent demand for mobility in India. And therefore, we need to not only look at survival through these difficult times, we need to think in terms of revival and we need to think in terms of growth. Now, there are several challenges that are facing a company which is engaged in, let's say, IC engine components in particular. First of all, it is our belief, and I think it has been reinforced in all the messages that we saw yesterday in the Siam Convention, including from Mr. Bhargav today, that IC engines will have to coexist with electric vehicles for a long time. In fact, this is both an opportunity and a challenge. The challenge of how to continue to invest in IC engine components because the demand is growing, and how to prepare for electric mobility alongside. So it is a challenge for persons who are engaged in IC engine components. And we have to deal with it, and we are dealing with it. The second part is, if you remember the presentation made by the gentleman from Brazil about the use of ethanol and how that has potential benefits, something that India needs to benchmark, keeping in view the fact that there is a long time yet before electric mobility will become mainstream. Whether it is in terms of jobs, or in terms of emissions, or in terms of cost of operations, or in terms of benefits for the farming community, on all accounts, ethanol, as per the presentation made yesterday, has a great solution. And I'm very happy that the government is also working on alternative fuels, which include CNG and ethanol. So alongside the current IC engine, we are preparing for use of alternative fuels, and we need as a country to continue to prepare for it. The fact that electric mobility is a matter of when and not if obviously there has to be parallel investment to prepare for this transition, which requires a strong balance sheet, which requires the ability to either acquire the technology or to develop the technology. And I think the entire component industry, more particularly those engaged in ICE, are already working in this regard. I have great confidence. We are a very entrepreneurial industry. Look at the way we dealt with COVID. It brought out the best in us. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that this transition will be handled well. All we need is some policy support and some hand-holding by our customers, which we are sure will be available.
Right. Mr. Kakkar, if I can begin with you, India's largest car maker, Mr. Bhargav yesterday had made a strong case for a tax reduction of regulatory pressures. He's saying that affordability is a big question. Car prices have substantially gone up in the last 2-3 years because of the taxation, because of the regulations that we have seen, and it will also rise in future. But looking at the volatile environment right now, you're looking at container shortages, you're looking at supply chain issues, you're looking at the move towards electric vehicle mobility. How has Maruti Suzuki been impacted by all these volatilities, all these disruptions we have been seeing over the last 2 years? Not to mention COVID-19 as well.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for this session. So I think as far as the current situation is concerned, it is a real VUCA word, probably what we are talking in our presentations and how we have to really prepare for it. I think time has come when we can actually demonstrate that how this VUCA word can be managed. So when you are talking about the container shortage and the commodity prices going up, semiconductor shortages, so all these issues have come up in a simultaneous manner. Where at Maruti Suzuki, we are doing a lot of activities to manage and control these aspects. So first, if we talk about, say, in terms of container shortages and how we can manage those, I think first of all, we have to be in a collaborative manner, discussing with the logistics suppliers and maybe engaging with them, giving them the advance notice of what is required to be imported in time. And also in terms of contracts, maybe getting into a little medium-term and long-term contracts to take care of these aspects. Second, when we talk about the commodity aspect, again, we are seeing that whether it is PGM or steel or any other commodities, it has been a phenomenal rise in last 1.5 years. So again, we have to see that how we can mitigate these. Of course, certain things are in our control and some things are not. But always our efforts to have a offset of these cost impacts by reducing somewhere else, whatever best we can do. So there are a lot of cost reduction measures which we are taking, whether it is in terms of reducing the consumption or to come out with the new ideas of VAV, how to improve the PGM effectiveness. So those kind of things we have to really see so that as a overall game, we are able to succeed in this. In terms of semiconductor shortage, globally, I think everybody has been hit. Again, a lot of factors are there. We have to see, Mr. Doreswamy is there fully aware on what kind of, whether it is pandemic or incident of fire incident in one of the semiconductor maker or polar vortex. A lot of issues which have happened globally, which have resulted into this. So there again, a collaborative approach with these makers, giving them in advance intimation of what we require, because all these are very long lead time items, which we really need to take care. So I think somewhere we have to see that in a collaborative manner, how we can discuss with these makers and have our plans intact so that these things can be taken care.
Right. No, that's an important thing because, as you said about semiconductors, and I was reading the PwC report, and they said that some consumer electronic companies have actually booked, have given bookings to semiconductor manufacturers for almost 18 months. So when you have those kind of timelines, it's very difficult for auto sector to get its due, considering it's probably even less than 5% of the total semiconductor output globally. But Mr. Sikka, if I can get you in right now. Now, we saw an interesting excerpt in this PwC report. It spoke about SafeNet, strong, agile, flexible, networked, enthusiastic, technology-enabled companies. Do you think this is extremely relevant for a company like Mahindra & Mahindra, which is not just into automotives, it is into farm equipment, tractors, defense, aerospace. So considering the vast number of businesses that Mahindra & Mahindra is into, you need greater synergy, you need a greater focus, more agility, more flexibility going forward.
So, Parikshit, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here with on the ACMA annual session. Clearly, let me start by first of all sharing a good news on the behalf of the tractor industry that in this gloom and doom of pandemic, I think the tractor industry has clearly outshone. And last year was our best ever year in the history of the tractor industry. We touched 900,000 unit sales of tractor as an industry. So this was the best year for the tractor industry as a whole. Now coming to the volatility, actually, Parikshit, volatility is good. It's not that none of us can manage the kind of volatility that we have seen. The issue comes that when the amplitude of this volatility is very high. So once in a 15-20 years event like you had the global financial crisis, or now that once in a century pandemic that we are currently going through, that the issues crop up, which none of us kind of has a template to go by. So as a result, when we face this issue of a pandemic and the sudden lockdowns were happening all across the country, in the Mahindra Group, we formulated a framework which is almost same as the topic of discussion today, which is survival, revival, and growth, which internally we call the walk, fly, and run framework. Obviously, in the walk framework is just like being on the survival mode. Like cash is blood for any business. If you have to survive, first of all, you have to stop the bleeding of the blood. So the first focus obviously for us was preservation of cash, making sure that all the cost which can be cut or deferred are done, whether these are variable cost, capex, short-term, fixed cost, a war on cost kind of stuff. Then making sure that our supply chain is robust enough because we are as good as our supply chain. So making sure that we engage with the supply chain proactively, be very transparent with them, show them our order book, make sure that we share our inventory details with them so that we can prioritize what we want to produce and what we don't want to produce. So all these initiatives were going on, and this is the framework that we have followed across our various group companies, making sure we have a very robust SOP for the health and hygiene of our own employees, making sure these SOPs are shared with everybody in the supply chain so that they don't have to rediscover the wheel again and maybe can learn from us and follow those health and hygiene practices which are very safe for their employees. Making sure that while we are doing all of this, we are being very, very collaborative in terms of making sure that all the competitors that we have, we are able to exchange and collaborate with each other so that even on the supply side, how can, while we compete in the market, how can we collaborate on the back end? So there were several initiatives that we were able to take, and I think that really helped us pass through the wave one, which was, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear at that point in time because the data was very sketchy. There was a lot of confusion. But as we rode the supply of wave one, and the tractor industry really bounced back very well within 6 to 8 weeks of the initial lockdown. I think the whole tractor industry decided that the time has come for us to now move from to, let's say, run phase, which is the revival phase. And I will talk more about that as we proceed with the panel discussion.
Right. Thank you for those thoughts, Mr. Sikka. My only intention was to ask broad questions, lay out the context on how you're dealing with the volatility in the system right now. And now let's get to specifics. Let's speak about semiconductors right now. This is the big talking point over the last 3 days. Mr. Doraiswamy, if I can begin with you. Any visibility? We have been speaking about semiconductors since, I think, October or November last year. Have we got a handle on it? Can we do any crystal ball gazing right now on how long are we going to be grappling with this?
Okay. Well, honestly speaking, no. We thought Q3 of this year is going to be a little bit of an improved situation. But looking at the current situation, I think even 2022, it may spill over to 2022, and for some parts, even 2023, as we look at this current stage. Even before I come into details, just to give a brief background, why did this happen? Yeah, if you look at the current usage of MCU in an average vehicle today, at least there are about 20 microcontrollers, and in an high-end vehicles, it could go even up to about 100 controllers. Yeah. Number two, I think as an industry, we missed two adjacent trends, what was happening. One was certainly the growth which was happening in the adjacent industry, that's non-automotive. Because of COVID, there was a huge demand for laptops, and also with the 5G, a lot of demand for IoT devices, and also handheld phones. So that's one. Number two, in the process of being very lean, I think most of our semiconductors manufacturers had sort of subcontracted the wafer manufacturing to foundries. And in this process, we landed up with one single foundry with about 56% of the automotive requirement. In contrast, if you look at that foundry, for that foundry, it's just only 4% of its sales, whereas he is supplying for 56% of the automotive requirement. I think these were the two things which, unfortunately, industry missed. Actually, if you look back, we had a very similar situation 10 years back, 2010, 2011, when we had this tsunami in Japan. We did, as an industry, we did learn a lot. The other one, certainly, I think going forward, we need to change the way which we work. You know, automotive is always known for lean, more inventory turns, less inventory. I think if you look at the process for wafer manufacturing, usually it takes about anywhere between 2 months to 6 months, and then the back end for converting to manufacturing for the semiconductors. So in this process, someone was holding a huge inventory while automotive was working on a sort of a 3 months firm schedules with a forecast of 18 months without a confirmation, maybe just a forecast. So when COVID hit us, I think the way in which the semiconductor industry also works, because they need to work at about 90 to 95% efficiency. If it falls below 90% capacity utilization, then there's a huge cost issue. If it crosses 95%, then you have a supply-demand situation. That's where we got into this. When automotive was down, those guys went and sold the capacities to non-automotive, and we landed up in a problem.
Right.
So as we see, I think there are a lot of capacities is being added, but unfortunately, the system is so dry, even a small jerk is causing a sort of an impact at the OEM end. For example, as we speak, 2 days back, even we thought Toyota is not impacted, but unfortunately, they made an announcement in the month of September. They will be producing 400,000 vehicles, less against 900,000 vehicles, original plan. So as we speak, there are capacities getting added, but usually the lead time for the for this is on the back end is about 6 to 9 months. On the front end, that's wafer manufacturing that could take about 1.5 years to 2 years. So for us to realize this additional capacities, I think it's going to take some time. While we thought, because everybody started taking actions in way back in October, November last year, and we thought in Q3 those capacities will get added to existing volumes. But unfortunately, a couple of incidents in between, like fire at one of our supply in Japan, or a snowstorm in Texas, or unfortunately the recent events what we see in Malaysia because of the COVID, those equipments actually which were meant for higher capacity utilizations got used to replace this. So we continue to struggle. If you ask me honestly, 2021 we have to live with this. 2022 we may see a small improvement, but certainly for some of the components it's going to spill over to even 2023.
Right. So it may even go up to 2023. So that is a strong outlook there. But Mr. Sondhi, coming to you, I think one thing that we have seen over the last 1.5 years, and this is something that Mr. Doreswamy also alluded to, that there were some companies who were able to manage it better because they were not dependent on only one supplier. And even now, those companies are doing slightly better than others. What have been the lessons from the semiconductor shortage, and from the SIAM perspective? Do you think we will be able to overcome it, and the automotive industry will somehow be able to mitigate the impact of the semiconductor shortage, as the likes of Mr. Prashant Doreswamy are saying could even continue to 2023? Do we have a plan in place? Does SIAM and auto OEMs have a plan in place to mitigate the impact of this semiconductor shortage and the lessons from it? Mr. Sondhi.
Parikshit, many lessons I think we've learned over the last 18 months. The The semiconductor is one such lessons, and you mentioned about steel and you mentioned about containers. So number one, as a CM, what can we do and work with the government? So that's one aspect of it. And then what can we do as an industry? So if I might answer one of them, is a lot of, we noticed that some of the other countries related to ministries of other countries were reaching out to suppliers directly. So SIAM has reached out to the Ministry of External Affairs to see whether we can make sure that at least India is not shortchanged to the extent possible. After all, these are all private industries. So there has to be a voice over there that India is there and needs its fair share of semiconductors. Similarly, on steel and casting, it's extremely important. We've reached out to the Commerce Ministry to see that if domestic mineral prices have not gone up, is there a justification or is there a benchmark with global prices setting domestic prices? And thirdly, as far as containers are concerned, we're working with the Ministry of Shipping, DG Shipping in particular, to see what we can do for additional allocation of containers for India. So that's at the governmental level and what support we can do vis-a-vis the government. Coming back to what SIAM is doing as individual industries are doing, actually now we need a dynamic master production plan. That is dynamic by the day to make sure that we are selecting the right models and the right mix and producing the right quantity for the market at a particular point in time. It's got extreme agility, really, because all of us are hand to mouth in almost all of this, semiconductors or availability of steel or pricing of steel or containers. So we are virtually working on a very agile, dynamic production plan, which is testing, I think, each one of us, I'm sure, extremely a lot. I think in a long term, we have no option as a country to be able to protect ourselves from semiconductor shortages. Now, the Tatas have announced something, but there is no option. It is as important as oil or data. We will have to have and be Atmanirbhar in semiconductors. Again, automobiles form, as you mentioned, 5%. I heard 10% of the share. We'll have to stay with this, but we've got to find solutions both internally and take whatever support we can from the government.
Right. Mr. Sodhi, if I may ask one more question before moving ahead, and that is, like the Tatas have spoken about exploring investments in semiconductor manufacturing, can auto OEMs take such a decision as well? Of course, this is something that will have a longer lead time. It's not something you can turn around in a year or two. But would there be discussions? Are there discussions ongoing within SIAM about that as well?
No, in terms of having auto OEM setting up something like this, is that the question?
Yes, that's right.
You got to see who is the driver of this. The driver is not the automobile industry. The driver is 5G electronics. That's where the volumes are coming from. And the driver is that the domestic base can give you 20-30% of the volume of the scale which is required. This has to be something which is a global platform set up in the country with an ecosystem which just goes far beyond just manufacturing fabs, for example. The ecosystem is hugely pure, isolated, clean. So there's a lot more to it than the industry coming together. But what we've got to do is to work collaboratively with the suppliers who currently exist, and SIAM is reaching out to them together and separately to ensure that we get our fair share of whatever is the whole mix with us. You also mentioned, can we work with, many times, especially on these critical components, you have a single source. You mentioned, should you be having more than one source? So I'm sure a number of people, number of OEMs are testing now alternative sources so that in some way we can mitigate this. But as Mr. Doreswamy said, ultimately the back end is supplied by somebody in Malaysia, somebody in Taiwan, somebody in Texas. And if anything goes wrong to this very fragile supply chain by way of a natural calamity, we are all, we'll have to find our way through this one as well. And I'm sure we'll find our way through this one as well.
Right. Thanks, Mr. Sondi. Mr. Sikka, now I'd like to ask you, Mahindra was also a company which was badly affected by the semiconductor shortage. And if I recall correctly, it was perhaps one of the first companies to go to the stock exchange last year. It was possibly in October, November, to inform that there will be a shortage, there will be some production cuts as a result of the semiconductor shortage. Uh, how have how has Mahindra been able to mitigate some of those pressures? The company is coming up with a new SUV in the market right now. I know you don't deal with that directly, but for the long term, for the next maybe 2 years or so, have contingency measures been put in place, Mr. Sikka?
So, Parikshit, yeah, thank you for asking me. So, first of all, let me clarify that the tractor industry as a whole is thankfully not impacted by the semiconductor shortage. We don't use this conductor, so as a result, the industry continues to be on growth path. Last year, our growth as an industry was 27%, and so far YTD, the industry is again doing a very good growth rate. Coming on the automotive side, like for any other OEMs, Mahindra was also severely impacted because of the supply chain issues on semiconductor, as Prashant has discussed and Mr. Sondi has discussed. I think it has been a huge learning and humbling experience. You know, before I took over as president of farm equipment business, I was the chief purchase officer for Mahindra for more than 10 years. And honestly, let me tell you, I had never ever heard of something called a semiconductor as part of my responsibility. These things were taken as given. Okay, nobody in their right frame of mind before the pandemic hit us even knew who are the suppliers, global supplier for semiconductor. Now we know each and every supplier. So this has been a hugely humbling experience, I think, for each purchasing guy across the world in the automotive sphere. We have been kind of brought up in an environment of just-in-time supply chains. And I think now the auto industry is learning it the hard way, that the gospel truth of just-in-time was not written in stone. And as the events unfold, as the new learning comes for us, I think just-in-time needs to be reviewed. Similarly, as Mr. Sondi just said, our dependence, it was always considered to be a great achievement for any purchasing guy if you could manage his supply chain with a single source. I think single source days are over. People will look at multiple sources and diversify the risk. The third risk was, and I remember participating in an ACMA panel discussion on how can Indian suppliers participate in the global value chain. So everything was global value chain. I think the time has come now for us to see how do we localize the entire supply chain within the country. These semiconductors are like oil. These are like precious metals. We can't depend on other countries to finally choke us on someday. And these can be because of geopolitical risks. These can be because of pandemics of the future. These can be anything. I think the country as a whole, the policy making has to move from being part of participating in the global supply chain to actually localizing the supply chain in the country, whether it is for semiconductor or for other materials as well. So I think this is a hard lesson learned.
If I may ask a follow-up question, you're saying that we must think about localization of semiconductors and other critical components. We cannot be dependent. That is a point that Mr. Kant also made some time back, that you need to reduce your import dependency for ECUs on China and maybe eliminate it in future as well.
Exactly.
Mahindra is a huge group with diversified interests. Is this something, semiconductor manufacturing, semiconductor localization, is this something that is probably being considered within the Mahindra group as well?
Parikshit, not as on date, we are not considering this. But let me tell you again to reinforce what Mr. Sondi said, that auto industry is actually globally consuming only 7% of semiconductors. The other big usage is electronics and telecom and other sectors. I think the time has come for maybe Reliance to look at getting into the semiconductor. They have the resources, they have the scale to kind of do that kind of job. And somebody will have to do it sooner or later. I think as a country, to mitigate our supply chain and as part of our overall risk mitigation, it's not only impacting auto industry, it's going to impact everything. The way we live, the way we work. I mean, this kind of communication that we are right now having, without semiconductors, we can't even have this kind of panel discussion. So this is going to touch each one of us for our own lives, whether it is health, whether it is live, work, play. And I think time has come for some of the largest groups in the country who have a large play in this area, who have scale, who have resources, to seriously consider this thing and start looking at it. again, it's a very, very long-term gestation project. It's not only 2 years of manufacturing. The designing is the key. Look at how Taiwan became a hub of semiconductor from nothing. And how did the companies in Taiwan build the whole designing phase first and then went into manufacturing? So I think it's very important that the industry, not only the auto industry, I think overall the Indian policymakers look at this, kind of come up with some kind of incentives from some large groups to look at it. And maybe that is our nirvana on semiconductor. Otherwise, we'll keep getting into this cycle. Today it is semiconductor, tomorrow it may be something else. So the larger point that I'm trying to make is the days, and it's a continuous learning. As you face more issues, you kind of learn the things which are written in stone are rubbed off and new things are written. And I think one of the things that we as an industry need to learn is that just-in-time days is over, dependence on single source is over, and just participating, being part of the global supply chain is over. We need to localize and make sure more and more value addition is done in the country, and the supply chain is localized within the boundaries of the country. It's
Right, very important statement.
I think.
So, Parikshit, if I may add.
Right, yeah, Mr. Doreswamy.
So, if I may add, so unfortunately, each vehicle today relies on multiple MCU suppliers, at least 6 to 8. Yeah. At the tier 3 level, there's a little choice. Unfortunately, 7 out of 10 MCU suppliers has gone to one single foundry. And also this microcontrollers does not easily allow for a second sourcing with component from another supplier because the architectures are different and they are unique to individual, because it's not only microcontroller, but it's also software dependent. So keeping with this as a constraints, what as an industry immediately can do certainly is revisit foundry policy, reduce reliance on industry on one single foundry, and also a balance of maintaining some amount of in-house chip manufacturing and also some amount of outsourcing. That's for the semiconductor suppliers. Second is when it comes to controllers, can we do dual sourcing? That means 2 designs for each ECU, for example. Then it comes with a cost. Then that as a tier 1 with OEMs, we need to have an agreement so that we have some fallback. Third one is, can we get into some sort of a tripartite agreement between OEMs, tier 1s, and also the semiconductor manufacturing? And the fourth, which certainly I think we should do, and most of us are doing, is having more inventory in the pipeline. That's number one. And also giving a little bit of a firm commitments for at least 12 months to 18 months so that your supplies are secured. So the last 2 things, I think it's a must for us to do, and we continue to do that. But apart from this, the other 3, what I just mentioned, is what industry is currently looking into. Can we explore that?
Right. No, you are very right there, Mr. Doreswamy. You cannot rely on one particular foundry because for some OEMs, especially Maruti Suzuki, we have seen how the supply disruptions due to a lockdown in Malaysia has disrupted Maruti's supply chain when it came to ECUs. Mr. Kakkar, if I can begin with you. Every OEM and every product in the market has a large number of models. Tell us how Maruti Suzuki is addressing the semiconductor shortage, your visibility on it. How soon will Maruti Suzuki itself be able to sort out? Initially, when the crisis had hit the industry, Maruti Suzuki was saying, we are fine, we are comfortable, we are monitoring the situation. But things started changing July onwards because of the lockdown in Malaysia. What's your visibility on the semiconductor shortage? And in your product mix, how are you making some changes to make sure that you are somehow defending yourself in this crisis, which can go on indefinitely for the next 2 years?
Yeah. So Parikshit, coming to the initial phase when the semiconductor shortage happened, say last year itself, things got started. So that time, basically, it was the COVID impact when after COVID or during the period, we had seen that the healthcare or the communication devices, laptops, a lot of places semiconductor usage had gone up and the demand has surged. That was the initial surge which happened. And of course, on the supply front, those investments were yet to take place when the capacity was to increase. So this was a phenomena which was happening between gap of supply versus the demand. And that time, probably with a lot of discussions with our tier 1 suppliers and including the semiconductor makers, we were having tri-party meetings and a lot of communication with them, where we could see that how different semiconductors, or in terms of our entire portfolio which we have, how could we have a model mix where we could still continue to produce. So I would say, even to the extent of last month also, we were able to manage all our productions which was there in terms of numbers, even though we had to make a lot of changes in terms of the mix. And with that, our suppliers, be it our Indian suppliers, so everybody was contributing, and the entire ACMA industry in various forms, they have supported us. Now, what has happened after that is that there are certain incidents which happened. For example, in Naka plant, Japan, the fire incident happened, or the polar vortex got impacted in few of the these plants in US. And then more so when the COVID impact happened in case of Malaysia, there it has happened start and stop type of thing which has happened. The plant is running, then suddenly COVID cases are increasing, the government is announcing plant has to be stopped. Now, when these sudden stoppages are happening which are unplanned, then for the industry like semiconductors, which is a very, very streamlined and a long lead time where you have to do entire planning in a very long-term manner. So that is the impact which has happened, and now we are getting affected because of, say, one single plant location in Malaysia. So there what happens is that once the plant gets again started, a lot of revalidation, and I think Mr. Doraiswamy has also seen, we have been discussing. So the semiconductor makers and the wafer makers, they have to see a lot of validations again on the quality levels. Then maybe the initial lots which were in work in progress, when they come to the finished state, then the final quality has to be again checked. So in terms of the complexity of the production as well as the long lead time, these jerks are very difficult to really absorb. So what we are affected now is more by the incidents which have happened, and rather than the medium-term impacts which are happening after COVID and the surge of demand. So that is how now we have also learned these lessons, and what Hemant was also saying, that any supply chain, even in my case also, now I know each and every bit of semiconductor, which was never seen at my level to that
On the
micro level.
fingertips.
Seeing each and every chip, how that has to come and when it has to fly. The entire thing we are monitoring along with our Japanese colleagues. So this is the extent to which we have gone into micro level this thing, but that is a current circumstance. And if we have to make more cars, we have to see that how more deliveries can happen. So more important is that de-risking, one of the very important things. There we have to see how semiconductor maker, be it backend or it is wafer, can we have some two locations at least across the globe where the same thing can be made, even at a little higher cost of maybe extra tooling, fixture, whatever. But it is still worth. Even if it happens once, it could create a lot of problems. So we have to balance it with regard to that. Some of the Japanese OEM component makers, they have started building inventories. So very right, just in time is not a formula for everything. So where we can build some inventories, those component suppliers have been able to tide over these crises much better than others who were little conservative in terms of ordering, probably could not imagine that the demand will go up so high for particularly cars in case of Maruti or for other OEMs. So that way we have to see, when Prashant is saying that they need long lead time. So now from Maruti side also, we are planning a horizon of 12 months and trying to give more and more realistic and little optimistic, I would say, in terms of our requirement. So that even if cars are little less, still we have inventory in pipeline. And we don't end up again in such a situation where the entire pipeline is dry, and any jerk or any single case of COVID where a particular building is blocked in Malaysia, we are immediately getting affected. So we need to have some dampers in between as a lesson learned. So that is our take.
No, that's an important point, Mr. Kakkar. So you said that you're now giving orders to ECU manufacturers for at least 12 months, giving them visibility for 12 months to make sure that you have adequate inventory in the system. Right. Let me get Mr. Ashok Taneja. Mr. Taneja, I'm sorry to keep you waiting on the issue, but there was a reason why I wanted to come to you in the end. And this is with regard to investments in semiconductor manufacturing. Mr. Sondi was quite right that auto industry, for an auto OEM to possibly go ahead and set up a semiconductor manufacturing plant may not make business sense, considering the small requirement of the industry. It is between the range of 5 to 10%. But how do we drive investments into this sector? Do you think enough is being done from government when it came to semiconductor manufacturing. The government is talking a lot about ethanols. It is talking about alternate fuels, electric vehicles, disruption in technologies. But do you think this is a crisis, and investments in semiconductor manufacturing, this is something that needs to be tackled head on?
Parikshit, first of all, we have faced a semiconductor crisis today. The learnings from the semiconductor crisis need to be applied to any other critical component where there is over dependence on a geography or a particular supplier. And I think this whole business of risk management will have to receive higher attention than has been possible in the past. I think Hemant mentioned that in the past there was a tendency to go for single source development in critical areas where the time required for development of components is long and testing time, validation time is long. Perhaps some amount of de-risking will be required. The second issue is about making India self-sufficient, Atmanirbhar in semiconductor manufacturing. I think we should look at this whole problem from a short-term, medium-term, and long-term point of view. In the short term, there is no possibility of any semiconductor manufacturing in India. Therefore, the solution as given by all the other co-panelists that we need to give a forecast for 12 to 18 months, we need to hold higher inventories, we need to work with 2 geographies. I think those need to be put in place. As far as the medium and long term is concerned, semiconductor manufacturing will happen in India only when either some industrial house takes a very big bet, and it's very encouraging to see that Tata Group have made one such statement. I hope there'll be more larger groups who come in with similar statements, or it is given tremendous amount of government support. If you look at the evolution of the semiconductor industry globally, practically everywhere, whether it's in Korea or in Taiwan or in Malaysia, the government of the day provided immense incentives for this to happen. Because investment is large, it takes a long time to put the facility in place and get all the designs and everything approved. And as a result, it is not economical in the way normal projects, investment projects are. The payout is over a much longer period. And you need to work at very high capacities, 90% plus, in order to make money in this business. So I think we need to approach this problem from all these 3 ends. Look at any other critical components and de-risk. In the short term, take all the steps as mentioned. And the long term, I would say SIAM particularly needs to take this up with Government of India to provide some sizable support for at least the first 1 or 2 units to be set up in India.
Right. No, that's an interesting point. Now I have to move on from semiconductors. We made this a semiconductor volatility discussion, but let's move on. Mr. Sondhi, I'd like to begin by talking to you about EVs and alternate fuels. While semiconductor, definitely it's a continuing volatility, there is uncertainty about how fast the EV adoption will take place, adoption of alternate fuels. Yesterday, the Petroleum Secretary said that ethanol is going to happen, flexi fuel is happening, you don't have a choice. Electric vehicles, you have to embrace. Your thoughts on that, especially I would like to ask you to wear your Ashok Leyland hat right now and tell me how disruptive is this for the commercial vehicle sector, both push towards EVs and alternate fuels.
So don't forget LNG and CNG too.
Yes, LNG, CNG, hybrids.
So my friend Ashok is making it even more difficult. But Parikshit, yeah, these are disruptions, and the question is how do you manage disruptions with as little disruption as possible. So let's take EVs and don't forget hydrogen in the future as well, and then all the other fuels that will come with it. The CV industry, and we talk about the CV industry from where I am, can be broadly split into three categories. Each of them will have their own trajectory. You have the light commercial vehicles, you have buses, and you have the medium and heavy commercial vehicles. The transition of EVs and intersection, really going a little further, intersection of mobility, of real estate, which is for charging infrastructure, therefore you have to read urban over there, and energy, and all of them have to come together harmoniously. Then there's going to be the higher cost of acquisition. You know, Mr. Bhargav talked a lot about affordability at the end of the day. So there is a higher cost of acquisition, of batteries especially. Prices are coming down. Are they coming down enough? There's a challenge of range anxiety. How much can I travel? And you're talking of buses, medium commercial vehicles, light commercial vehicles. There's a challenge of charging infrastructure, which is sufficiency and reliability, maturity of the product, what will happen as you move forward, and then reskilling and upskilling of the entire ecosystem, which is dealers, technicians, frontline people, etc. So the thing is, when you look at buses and buses for urban areas, they are likely to see the faster change because metros can control setting up an ecosystem which can be more relevant, and this is taking place as we speak. So STUs are ordering a certain percentage of the requirement as EVs, but we've got to also e-buses. But we also got to remember many of them want to buy on pay-per-use. They don't want to buy strictly on the basis of the entire capex. So you've got to create an intermediate vehicle, which we have created. We've created Switch Mobility, which is going to be a fully owned subsidiary of Ashok Leyland, and OHM, which will actually be e-mass supplier, which will actually own the asset and then give it to an let's say a prospective customer, could be an STU, on a pay-per-use basis. So the new models of disruption are coming up, which will help us going forward. The second is light commercial. Okay, coming back to interstate buses. Interstate buses will still use alternative fuels. So it may not be diesel, it will be a blend. Not ethanol. Ethanol, I think, more for smaller vehicles, but LNG and then going into hydrogen. Are we working on all of these? The answer is yes. Then you come to light commercial vehicles. Light commercial vehicles, again, for e-commerce applications, that is for warehouses outside cities and towns, going into cities and towns where there is a charging infrastructure, will have e-LCVs happening more and more. But it's likely where Mr. Sikka operates in the farm sector, in rural areas, it will still be diesel or alternate fuels. And then you come to medium and heavy commercial vehicles, which are essentially cross-country. There we will have a mixture of CNG, a mixture of LNG, hydrogen, whether it's hydrogen IC engines or hydrogen fuel cells, that's a matter of debate. But what OEMs therefore have to do and are doing, I'm sure all of them, but I can talk of commercial vehicles and Ashok Leyland. We have no option but to work on a mix of fuels because government is driving CNG hard. Government is for cross-country looking at LNG and is going to make it available. And I think we are going to move into a hydrogen ecosystem in 5 to 7 years before we know it. And therefore, it's better to start working on that as well. So many things going on simultaneously. I don't think there are too many options but to work with them. But also got to remember, Parikshit, that if we are playing internationally, many of the markets which India deals with, which is Middle East, Africa, etc., are still non-emissionized. They're still going to have a lot of diesel. They're still on BS3, BS2, BS3, BS4. So the IC engine is here to stay for a fairly long period of time. It will be modified by way of CNG, LNG, and we can crack it hydrogen, but may not be, and then we fuel cells. But you have a whole play going on, and we have to build the skills and the technology to play in each one of these segments. It's the most interesting time, if I'd say. I mean, it's challenging, but it's the most interesting time because we are learning. a huge amount through all of this. It's like the semiconductor issue. We never knew what it was. We actually went deep into it. Similarly, I
Absolutely.
think we'll extract the best out of IC engines, and we'll also work towards what is needed for pollution and for saving foreign exchange for the country through the use of EV.
Right. Let me get in Mr. Sikka now. Mr. Sikka, how well is the farm equipment sector under you, under Mahindra and Mahindra, poised to look at this transition in ethanol, in alternate fuels, and also with regard to electric vehicle mobility? How is your roadmap going to unfold over the next 10 years? How will the change happen in the farm equipment segment?
Parikshit, I think Mr. Sondi covered it that in the farm equipment sector, this would be at the rear end of the chain. As we have seen that the case for three-wheelers became positive a couple of years back, two-wheelers are now looking very promising. And I'm sure eventually the automotive side, the passenger side will also become electric. And then the smaller commercial vehicles and all the briefing that Mr. Soni just did will follow that cycle. And I think at some point at the later part of this transition, will the tractors migrate from IC engine to electric? Is still some time away. I think before that, the transition which will happen is on the bio CNG side, where the industry is already working with certain suppliers to make sure that retrofitment kits are available, which can be both OE fitted and aftermarket fitting. So I think alternate fuels is a more viable strategy currently for a tractor industry, and also because of certain technological gaps that are required for the tractor, which is not required for the passenger vehicle segment. I mean, passenger vehicles finally have to run on a tar or a concrete road. A tractor doesn't run on that. A tractor has to perform some applications into different soil conditions, which vary from state to state and from country to country. So as a result, the technological gaps on the electric side still exist. We need to find some answers, but clearly the transition, which be at the later part of the industry as the industry transits from IC engine to electric vehicle. However, I want to bring in the same point and the learning from the semiconductor industry. Like 2 years back, nobody had heard of semiconductors. Similarly, as we transition as a country from IC engine in a large way to the electric vehicle, I think the policymakers and the industry as a whole need to sit together and chalk out the entire supply chain for electric vehicle materials. And in that, I think the raw material availability in terms of lithium, cobalt is extremely critical. That would be the new oil as we go ahead, meaning it's strategic. And we should not have a situation where 10 years down the line, you are moderating a panel discussion, obviously with different set of people, that why this was not conceived 10 years back, but now we are getting stuck because of cobalt not available, lithium not available, and so country has stopped their supplies to India. So I think these kind of forward-looking interventions are required now. We know that certain countries are rich in lithium and cobalt, whether it is the Chile Triangle or the African continent or Australia. We need to have long-term supply chain commitments in terms of mining rights, access to these materials. Only then we will be able to kind of sustain a growth path for the auto industry as a whole. Because this is not few 100,000 units we are talking about. This is millions of vehicles that have to move from IC engine to electric vehicles. So, like we have a very secure supply of oil across the world, do we have similar assurance that there is a similar secure supply of raw materials, minerals for electric vehicles? Several
Right.
wars have been fought over oil. I think we should not have a war over lithium and cobalt and over semiconductor. So it's very, very important that we do some forward thinking and are able to secure the supplies.
That's a very interesting point you're talking, because one thing that so many international dailies are talking about is the large mineral wealth that Afghanistan has. 1.4 million metric tons of rare metals, including lithium and uranium. They have more
Exactly.
than 60 million metric tons of copper. And China had a major deal with Afghanistan, which of course nobody knows what will happen to that. But of course, natural resources having long-term commitments and visibility on that is extremely important. But let me move on a little fast now. We have about 14 minutes left. In fact, 12 minutes. Mr. Kakkar, I'd like to speak about localization. You're free to talk about what Mr. Sondi and Mr. Sikka said about alternate fuels. But with regard to the localization roadmap, SIAM and ACMA are talking to the government, saying that there is a certain roadmap that we can achieve in the next few years. I think it's a 20,000 to 30,000 crore localization that can be achieved in India over the next few years. How do you think it will help the industry? What components are likely to be localized? And what is the time frame that the industry is working with, Mr. Kakkar?
Yeah. So I think as a part of the sourcing committee, EC sourcing committee chairman, myself and my co-chairs, we had worked very deeply in this area for localization, because as we know that Atmanirbhar Bharat is right from our honorable Prime Minister, that message is coming very clearly. And the way a lot of focus is there today, even the lessons learned from semiconductor, what Mr. Hemant is saying about future EV requirement of raw material. So localization is going to be the key. Whether we are talking about affordability for the customers in the newer technology regulations. So that has become the real backbone. And unless we really work very hard as a cohesive and collaborative manner, I think the future challenges are going to be even more difficult. So that keeping that in mind, we had done a mapping of what is currently being imported. As a total import bill of the country, we had examined the entire automotive requirements, what is being done. So fortunately, we had a very collaborative approach among the SIAM group members, different industry segment, whether it is two-wheeler, three-wheeler, farm equipments, commercial, everybody was included in that. Also the ACMA members, there was a big participation from them. Also, we had industry bodies like Atma and all the other groups who had also supported. So the approach was very clear that what is currently being imported, we had examined that, which are the countries from where imports are happening, what are the major key technological changes which are going to come when we are not talking about alternative fuels, when we are talking about EVs, or we are talking about other future technologies. Localization, anybody is going to invest only if it is going to sustain for some more time, or that technology is going to remain. So very clearly in each of the product category, the mapping was done that how technological trends are going to take place in future. Because if we are talking a time frame of 5 years, 2 to 5 years of short-term and medium-term plans, so that is how different categories were broken and the CFTs were made, who had done the deep dive into that and really studied that what kind of technological trends are coming. Then the barriers, what are the major barriers? One, of course, is a volume and different in terms of steel. If we talk about special steels which are required, or if we are talking about semiconductors, then PLI and big support from government is required. So area by area, we have examined that what is the responsibility of the OEM, what is that ACMA members need to contribute, what is that government needs to advise, and what is the support they can provide. So a clear roadmap has been made, keeping all these categories in mind. And the figure which you are saying around 34,000 is what has been kept as a plan or a target, I would say, for the entire localization. So this is how I think the commitment has come from all the stakeholders. And we will be reviewing this and reporting to ECCM and then, of course, to the government also on the progress which is happening. So somewhere where we say that whether Taiwan has taken a lead in some area or China is doing something, so we have to also see that how India strengths can be leveraged. And also in case of technology has to be brought from outside, then these global players, how they can be attracted to make investments in India. So those kind of detailed action plan has been made, and we intend to achieve it in time.
Right. Mr. Taneja, we have a localization roadmap which is being discussed, but then how do we focus on making exports more competitive? The ROTEP scheme has been announced, but the industry is saying it's not a replacement for MEIS. We're still awaiting the contours of the PLI scheme. But with regard to making exports more competitive, where are we? What needs to be done? Mr. Taneja.
Parikshit, before I answer that, I want to make a comment about these alternative fuels and the various technologies, including battery electric vehicle technology. It is precisely for this reason that there are several technologies that will coexist before we eventually migrate to electric vehicles. That a recommendation was made to the government, which I believe still needs to be taken up. That our approach should be to fix CAFE norms and become technology agnostic. Maruti may choose a different route to achieve their CAFE norms, and another competing company may choose a different technology to achieve those norms. Instead of specifying a technology, we should specify what norms we want achieved, and let it be let the freedom be with the manufacturers to decide what's the best way forward. Yes, on some things like ethanol, because it has dimensions that go beyond auto industry, it affects the farming community and so on and so forth. It has an impact on jobs. There are political dimensions. You can mandate some things. But otherwise, CAFE norms and a technology agnostic approach, which should include freedom to OEMs to use hybrid technology, which is a great transition technology actually, and must be relooked at. 30 to 50% improvement in fuel efficiency, no requirement of infrastructure, no loss of jobs, and ability to scale up very quickly. This needs to be looked at, and I hope SIAM in its wisdom will take this forward with the government. About exports, I think all that we exports is about two things. It's about competitiveness, and it's about having access to those markets. Because as far as the Indian component industry is concerned, access to technology is not appearing to be a problem. Our cost competitiveness is currently getting impacted by uncertainty about the incentives. So many of us do not take a RODTEP or a MEIS incentive into account when we make plans to export our components outside the country. Because by the time you quote, it takes 2 years to 3 years before the business matures. And then the incentives are available for the following 1 or 2 years at best. While the program will continue for the next 5 to 8 years. So whatever incentives are available, these need to be stable and long-term in order for these to make some difference to our export competitiveness. The second is, we all recognize that our cost of logistics in the country is significantly higher. Dr. Pawan Goenka also mentioned this in his address. That's one of the areas we need to work at. 13 to 14% versus 6 to 7% across the world. That's a big disadvantage, cost disadvantage. Beyond that, I think industry needs to play its role. We need to look at exports as an integral and serious part of our strategy. We cannot think only local, manufacturing locally for the local market. We have to think beyond that. It will require some risk taking, and I think every company which has built its business on exports has benefited from technology, leadership, has benefited from profitability, and therefore that needs to be to go forward.
Okay. All right. Mr. Doraiswamy, I'm sorry to keep you waiting, but now to get you in, we have about 3 minutes left, and I'm going to try and squeeze in an answer from you and Mr. Sondhi in the end. But Mr. Doraiswamy, coming to you, looking at the disruptions in technology that we're looking at, push towards EVs, push towards hydrogen, LNG, CNG, ethanol, keeping all of this in mind, how are you advising your clients, your OEM partners, on how to remain flexible and agile, how to manage growth in the next 10 years as a leading component manufacturer, not just in India, but across the world? Where are you putting your money? How are you channelizing your investments and keeping them in order of priority?
Okay, so if I have to talk about one thing, certainly we are living in very interesting times. Tech transformation of this magnitude we see now is a rare phenomena. It is very disruptive with the power of revolutionizing the way we live, way do things, even we think. I think this is an exciting for any industry and more so for automotive manufacturing, where organizations are constantly looking for ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness. So if one thing if I have to talk about, certainly with regard to Industry 4.0, So how do we stay relevant? How do we reduce our cost with all these changes which happening? I think the manufacturing sector is gradually moving towards transforming from a traditional shop floors into smart factories. The benefits are apparent. However, the transformation effort, yeah, intensive could be capital intensive, certainly, and also there's no one size fits all. It varies from company to company. So, keeping this in mind, certainly on the manufacturing side, we have done a huge investment on the Industry 4.0, and we started this journey 4.5 years back. And that has really helped us to keep our costs much under control despite having lesser utilizations and also operating with a lean strength even during the COVID times. I think we need to understand the benefits which outplay the initial burden of heavy investments. I think the ultimate goal of this profiting production process is to achieve higher efficiency, complete transparency, traceability, accountability, and sustainability with more and more of electronics coming into manufacturing. Yeah, I think we are moving from hard work to smart work. So that's one certainly on the manufacturing side. We have invested a lot, keeping all this in mind and the future of the vehicle mobility. And if you ask me, my personal paradoxes as a leader, I think I'm grappling with 7 conflicts, if I have to say. One is struggling to address new challenges. I have to accept that. Yeah. Number 2, starting to get being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Third one, strengthening the organization by exposing the weaknesses. Then keeping control by owning less and also celebrating failure as a fast learning. So these are some of the things which I'm slowly trying to adapt to face the future.
Right. Very interesting. Mr. Sondi, I'll give you the final word. Any thoughts that you would like to leave us with as to how you see the auto industry moving from here over the next 5 to 10 years? I think Mr. Saraswat yesterday gave a roadmap on how much electric vehicle penetration, fuel cell penetration, hybrid penetration we can achieve. But really, where do you see the auto industry going in terms of green mobility, in terms of electric vehicles, ICs? What would be your roadmap finally, your final words?
No, I think, Parikshit, and thank you for this asking me. Our first slide yesterday in the SIAM conference is, if you have to be in the top 5 in the world in terms of GDP, your auto industry has to also be a major, major player and is amongst the top contributor to the economy in each one of those countries. So it is extremely important that government and industry work together to ensure that the health of the auto industry and the competitiveness, which is largely dependent on the industry itself, but to remove any roadblocks, to make sure that over the next 10 years, this industry prospers, which means technology, employment, skill, and scale. And finally, it has to be made in India, but made for the world. I know it sounds cliche, made for the world, but we've got to be able to create in India. We must be able to design through to be able to set up clusters in different parts of the world of assembly plants, each one of us, to be able to cater to the entire world in terms of where the auto industry is. Now, within that, there'll be tectonic shifts, there will be changes in fuel, there'll be changes in policy, but we've got an extremely skillful, vibrant, and you look at ACMA, it's absolutely world class. And we must retain that world class sense within us. So I see this as a great industry for the future. I see it a great industry for employment, and we'd encourage young people with skills. It's a technological industry. It's no longer the industry that people saw it as brick and mortar. It's a techno info manufacturing. I mean, it's got everything. So I would encourage young people to come and join this industry, whether as OEMs or as part of component manufacturers, and set this up as a future base for growth for India to be a global powerhouse in the automobile sector.
All right, we've completely run out of time, but I'd like to thank all our panelists today for joining us. Mr. Taneja, Mr. Doreswamy, Mr. Kakkar, Mr. Sikka, and Mr. Vipin Sondi. Lots to think about. And of course, it gives a lot of clarity on how the industry is dealing with the challenges, including semiconductor shortages on a daily basis, how the entire paradigm towards manufacturing is going to change, and also how to remain agile and flexible with at a time when there are so many disruptions in technology taking place. Thanks once again, and I'm going to hand it over back to Mr. Deepak Jain and Mr. Vinny Mehta. Thank you so much.
Parikshit, thank you very much, and thank you to all our eminent panelists. You kept us enthralled for almost an hour and 15 minutes and more, if I'm not mistaken, and you covered a diverse range of subjects. Amazing. You talked about semiconductor challenges, you talk about EV and the EV supply chain issues, alternative fuels, supply chain for raw materials, localization issues, on technology imperatives, on competitiveness of the industry, export worthiness of the industry. And of course, I loved some of the phrases, being comfortable with the uncomfortable, celebrating failure, and last but not the least, made in India, made for the world. And what took me on a new high was clusters of Indian industry in different parts of the world. So thank you, gentlemen, for such a wonderful session. Thank you for your time. And as I've always said, this is the most sought after session in the ACMA annual session. So thank you for, in some sense, walking the talk. My most sincere gratitude to all of you. And I think, Deepak, you would also want to thank them.
Well, I can only thank on behest of our community, sir. I think I see 5 eminent panelists, intelligentsia of our community on the screen. And I think that's truly the collaboration and the thing. So thank you very much for your time. And Parikshit, I think you did a great job in moderating and actually engaging us. I think 90 minutes, how it went, we couldn't feel it. So thank you once again for all your insights. And may basically God bless us all, and may we flourish in our rightful place. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We will now take a
so
short
much,
break of
Thank
10
you.
minutes. And I look forward to welcoming you to the next session. This is going to be an exclusive session with our Secretary for Department of Heavy Industry, Shri Arun Goyal. So quickly go grab a sandwich. I know instead of the ACMA session is so heavy and there's so much food for thought, I don't think so we're thinking about lunch, but go grab a sandwich and be back with us in 10 minutes. 2:45, I'll be there to welcome you again. Thank you so much.